Hello, everyone, and welcome to Soft Stories. I'm Stratton, and this is Pepper, and today we are going to be continuing our reading of The Borrowers by Mary Norton, with the original illustrations by Diana Stanley. Before we begin, as I have done the last couple of videos, I just want to repeat my request for the submission of questions for the Q&A episode that my girlfriend and I are planning to produce soon. It should be interesting. If you haven't heard, we're doing our own take on the First We Feast series, Hot Ones. We've just completed our set of 10 sources, all of which have been featured on the original show. A recent trip to World Market provided the last 4 that we needed to round out our number, which means that all we require for a Q&A is questions. Some of you have been kind enough to submit questions to me, and I so appreciate it. I look forward to sharing those answers in the video and shouting out those of you who were kind enough to ask questions. So please, if there's anything about the series, myself, Pepper, or any aspect of life in general that you would like to hear me expound on while I'm in exquisite agony from millions of Scoville units, please write a message in the comments below, and I would be delighted to answer it for you, or to address any of those comments that you wish to. Thank you so much for engaging with the channel. It means everything to me. Well, I have waxed poetic long enough, so let's get back to The Borrowers. When last we left the story, the boy had discovered the home of the Clock family had torn the roof off from their heads, something which was seen as very uncouth, until he began to provide interior decorations for them, something which Homily seemed to warm to quite quickly. So that's where we're picking up, with the aftermath of that first house call by the boy to Arietti, Homily, and Pod. Chapter 16. Then began a curious phase in their lives, borrowings beyond all dreams of borrowing, a golden age. Every night the floor was opened and treasures would appear. A real carpet for the sitting room, a tiny coal scuttle, a stiff little sofa with damask cushions, a double bed with a round bolster, a single ditto with a striped mattress, framed pictures instead of stamps, a kitchen stove which didn't work but which looked lovely in the kitchen. There were oval tables and square tables and a little desk with one drawer. There were 2 maple wardrobes, one with a looking glass, and a bureau with curved legs. Homily grew not only accustomed to the roof coming off, but even went so far as to suggest to Pod that he put the board on hinges. "It's just the hammering I don't care for," she explained. "It brings down the dirt." When the boy brought a grand piano, Homily begged Pod to build a drawing room. Here we can see all of the various treasures that have been brought by the boy, and poor Homily and Pod rearranging them to fit their lifestyle. "Next door to the sitting room," she said, "and we could move the storerooms farther down. Then we could have those gilt chairs he talks about, and the palm in a pot." Pod, however, was a little tired of furniture removing. He was looking forward to the quiet evenings where he could doze at last beside the fire in his new velvet chair. No sooner had he put a chest of drawers in one place when Homily, coming in and out of the door to get the effect, made him try it somewhere else. And every evening, at about his usual bedtime, the roof would fly up and more stuff would arrive. But Homily was tireless, bright-eyed and pink-cheeked. After a long day's pushing and pulling, she still would leave nothing until morning. "Let's just try it," she would beg, lifting up one end of a large doll's sideboard so that Pod would have to lift the other. "It won't take a minute." But as Pod well knew, in actual fact it would be several hours before, dishevelled and aching, they finally dropped into bed. Even then, Homily would sometimes hop out to have one last look. In the meantime, in payment for these riches, Arietti would read to the boy. Every afternoon, in the long grass beyond the cherry tree, he would lie on his back, and she would stand beside his shoulder and tell him when to turn the page. They were happy days to look back on afterwards, with the blue sky beyond the cherry boughs, and the grasses softly stirring, and the boy's great ear listening beside her. She grew to know that ear quite well, with its curves and shadows and sunlit pinks and golds. Sometimes, as she grew bolder, she would lean against his shoulder. He was very still while she read to him, and always grateful. What worlds they would explore together! Strange worlds to Arietti. She learned a lot, and some of the things she learned were hard to accept. She was made to realize once and for all that this earth on which they lived, turning about in space, did not revolve, as she had believed, for the sake of little people. "Nor for big people either," she reminded the boy when she saw his secret smile. In the cool of the evening, Pod would come for her, a rather weary Pod, dishevelled and dusty, to take her back for tea. And at home there would be an excited Homily and fresh delights to discover. "Shut your eyes," Homily would cry. "Now, open them." And Arietti, in a dream of joy, would see her home transformed. All kinds of surprises there were. Even, one day, lace curtains at the grating, looped up with pink string. Their only sadness was that there was no one there to see. No visitors, no casual droppers in, no admiring cries and envious glances. What would Homily have not given for an overmantel or a harpsichord? Even a rain barrel would have been better than no one at all. You write to your Uncle Henry, Homily suggested, and tell him. A nice long letter, mind, and don't leave anything out. Arietti began the letter on the back of one of the discarded pieces of blotting paper, but it became, as she wrote it, just a dull list, far too long, like a sale catalogue or the inventory of a house to let. She would have to keep jumping up to count spoons or to look up words in the dictionary, and after a while she laid it aside. There was so much else to do, so many new books to read, and so much, now, that she could talk of with the boy. He's been ill, she told her mother and father. He's been here for the quiet and the country air, but soon he'll go back to India. Did you know, she asked the amazed Homily, that the Arctic night lasts 6 months, and that the distance between the two poles is less than that between the two extremities of a diameter drawn through the equator? Yes, they were happy days, and all would have been well, as Pod said afterwards, if they had stuck to borrowing from the doll's house. No one in the human household seemed to remember it was there, and consequently nothing was missed. The drawing room, however, could not help but be a temptation. It was so seldom used nowadays. There were so many knick-knack tables which had been out of Pod's reach, and the boy, of course, could turn the key in the glass doors of the cabinet. The silver violin he brought them first, and the silver harp. It stood no higher than Pod's shoulder, and Pod restrung it with horsehair from the sofa in the morning room. A musical conversazione, that's what we could have, cried the exulting Homily as Arietti struck a tiny, tuneless note on a horsehair string. If only, she went on fervently, clasping her hands, your father would start on the drawing room. She curled her hair nearly every evening nowadays, and since the house was more or less straight, she would occasionally change for dinner into a satin dress. It hung like a sack, but Homily called it Grecian. We could use your painted ceiling, she explained to Arietti, and there are quite enough of those toy builder's bricks to make a parquet floor. Parquet, she would say. Parquet. Just like a harpsichord. Even great Aunt Sophie, right away upstairs in the littered grandeur of her bedroom, seems distantly affected by a spirit of endeavour which seemed to flow in gleeful whirls and eddies about the staid old house. Several times lately, Pod, when he went to her room, had found her out of bed. He went there nowadays not to borrow, but to rest. The room, one might almost say, had become his club, a place to which he could go to get away from things. Pod was a little irked by his riches. He had never visualized, not in his wildest dreams, borrowing such as this. Homily, he felt, should call a halt. Surely now their home was grand enough. These jewelled snuff-boxes and diamond-encrusted miniatures, these filigree vanity cases and Dresden figurines, all, as he knew from the drawing-room cabinet, were not really necessary. What was the good of a shepherdess nearly as tall as Arietti, or an outsized candle snuffer. Sitting just inside the fender, where he could warm his hands at the fire, he watched Aunt Sophie hobble slowly round the room on her 2 sticks. "She'll be downstairs soon, I shouldn't wonder," he thought, glumly, hardly listening to her oft-told tale about a royal luncheon aboard a Russian yacht. "Then she'll miss these things." It was not Aunt Sophie, however, who missed them first. It was Mrs. Driver. Mrs. Driver had never forgotten the trouble over Rosa Pickhatchet. It had not been, at the time, easy to pinpoint the guilt. Even Crampfurl had felt under suspicion. "From now on," Mrs. Driver had said, "I'll manage on me own. No more strange maids in this house." A drop of Madeira here, a pair of old stockings there, a handkerchief or so, an odd vest, or an occasional pair of gloves. These, Mrs. Driver felt, were different. These were within her rights. But trinkets out of the drawing-room cabinet? That, she told herself grimly, staring at the depleted shelves, was a different story altogether. Standing there, on that fateful day, in the spring sunshine, feather duster in hand, her little black eyes had become slits of anger and cunning. She felt tricked. It was, she calculated, as though someone, suspecting her dishonesty, were trying to catch her out. But who could it be? Crampfurl? That boy? The man who came to wind the clocks? These things had disappeared gradually, one by one. It was someone, of that she felt sure, who knew the house, and someone who wished her ill. Could it, she wondered suddenly, be the mistress herself? The old girl had been out of bed lately and walking about her room. Might she not have come downstairs in the night, poking about with her sticks, snooping and spying? Mrs. Driver remembered suddenly the empty Madeira bottle and the 2 glasses which, so often, were left on the kitchen table. Thought Mrs. Driver, was not this just the sort of thing she might do? The sort of thing she would cackle over, back upstairs again among her pillows, watching and waiting for Mrs. Driver to report the loss. "Everything all right downstairs, Driver?" That's what she'd always say, and she would look at Mrs. Driver sideways out of those mocking old eyes of hers. "I wouldn't put it past her," Mrs. Driver exclaimed aloud, gripping her feather duster as though it were a club. "And a nice Merry Andrew she'd look if I caught her at it, creeping about the downstairs rooms in the middle of the night. All right, my lady," muttered Mrs. Driver grimly. "Pry and potter, all you want. 2 can play at that game." Chapter 17. Mrs. Driver was short with Crampfurl that evening. She would not sit down and drink with him as usual, but stumped about the kitchen, looking at him sideways every now and again out of the corners of her eyes. He looked uneasy, as indeed he was. There was a kind of menace in her silence, a hidden something which no one could ignore. Even Aunt Sophie had felt it when Mrs. Driver brought up her wine. She heard it in the clink of the decanter against the glass as Mrs. Driver set down the tray, and in the rattle of the wooden rings as Mrs. Driver drew the curtains. It was in the tremble of the floorboards as Mrs. Driver crossed the room, and in the click of the latch as Mrs. Driver closed the door. "What's the matter with her now?" Aunt Sophie wondered vaguely, as delicately, ungreedily, she poured the first glass. The boy had felt it too, from the way Mrs. Driver had stared at him as he sat hunched in the bath, from the way she soaped the loofah, and the way she said, "And now?" She had scrubbed him slowly, with a careful, angry steadiness. And all through the bathing time, she did not say a word. When he was in bed, she had gone through all his things, peering into cupboards and opening his drawers. She had pulled his suitcase out from under the wardrobe and found his dear dead mole and his hoard of sugar lumps and her best potato knife. But even then she had not spoken. She had thrown the mole into the waste-paper basket and had made sharp noises with her tongue. She pocketed the potato knife and all the sugar lumps. She had stared at him a moment before she turned the gas low. A strange stare it had been, more puzzled than accusing. Mrs. Driver slept above the scullery. She had her own back stairs. That night she did not undress. She set the alarm clock for midnight and put it, where the tick would not disturb her, outside her door. She unbuttoned her tight shoes and crawled, grunting a little, under the eiderdown. She had barely closed her eyes, as she told Crampfurl afterwards, when the clock shrilled off, chattering and rattling on its 4 thin legs on the bare boards of the passageway. Mrs. Driver tumbled herself out of bed and fumbled her way to the door. "Shush," she said to the clock as she felt for the catch. "Shush." She clasped it to her bosom. She stood there, in her stocking feet, at the head of the scullery stairs. Something, it seemed, had flickered below, a hint of light. Mrs. Driver peered down the dark curve of the narrow stairway. Yes, there it was again. A moth-wing flutter. Candlelight. That's what it was, a moving candle. Beyond the stairs, beyond the scullery, somewhere within the kitchen. Clock in hand, Mrs. Driver creaked down the stairs in her stockinged feet, panting a little in her eagerness. There seemed a sigh in the darkness, an echo of movement. And it seemed, to Mrs. Driver, standing there on the cold stone flags of the scullery, that this sound, that was barely a sound, could only mean one thing. The soft swing-to of the green baize door, that door which led out of the kitchen into the main hall beyond. Hurriedly, Mrs. Driver felt her way into the kitchen and fumbled for matches along the ledge above the stove. She knocked off a pepper pot and a paper bag of cloves, and glancing quickly downwards, saw a filament of light. She saw it in the second before she struck a match. A glowworm thread, it looked like, on the floor beside her feet. It ran in an oblong shape, outlining a rough square. Mrs. Driver gasped and lit the gas, and the room leapt up around her. She glanced quickly at the baize door. There seemed to her startled eye a quiver of movement in it, as though it had just swung to. She ran to it and pushed it open, but the passage beyond was still and dark. No flicker of shadow, nor sound of distant footfall. She let the door fall again and watched it as it swung back, slowly, regretfully, held by its heavy spring. Yes, that was the sound she had heard from the scullery, that sighing whisper, like an indrawn breath. Cautiously, clutching back her skirts, Mrs. Driver moved towards the stove. An object lay there, something pinkish, on the floor beside the jutting board. Ah, she realized, that board. That was where the light had come from. Mrs. Driver hesitated and glanced about the kitchen. Everything else looked normal, and just as she had left it. The plates on the dresser, the saucepans on the wall, and the row of tea towels hanging symmetrically on their string above the stove. The pinkish object she saw now was a heart-shaped cashew box, one that she knew well from the glassed-in tray table beside the fireplace in the drawing room. She picked it up. It was enamel and gold and set with tiny brilliants. "Well, she began, and stooping swiftly with a sudden angry movement, she wrenched back the piece of floor. And then she shrieked, long and loud. She saw movement, a running, a scrambling, a fluttering. She heard a squeaking, a jabbering, and a gasping. Little people they looked like, with hands and feet and mouths opening. That's what they looked like, but they couldn't be that, of course. Running here, there, and everywhere. "Oh, oh, oh!" she shrieked, and felt behind her for a chair. She clambered onto it and wobbled. It wobbled beneath her, and she climbed, still shrieking, from the chair to the table. And there she stood, marooned, crying and gasping, and calling out for help until, after hours it seemed, there was a rattling at the scullery door. Crabfell it was, roused at last by the light and the noise. "What is it?" he called. "Let me in." But Mrs. Driver would not leave the table. A nest, she shouted. "Alive and squeaking." Crabfell threw his weight against the door and burst open the lock. He staggered, slightly dazed, into the kitchen, his corduroy trousers pulled on over his nightshirt. "Where?" he cried, his eyes wide beneath his tousled hair. "What sort of a nest?" Mrs. Driver, sobbing still with fright, pointed at the floor. Crabfell walked over in his slow, deliberate way and stared down. He saw a hole in the floor, lined and cluttered with small objects. Children's toys, they looked like. Bits of rubbish, that was all. "It's nothing," he said after a moment. "It's that boy, that's what it is." He stirred the contents with his foot and all the partitions fell down. "There ain't nothing alive in there." "But I saw them, I tell you," gasped Mrs. Driver. "Little people, like with hands, or mice, dressed up." Crabfell stared into the hole. "Mice, dressed up," he repeated uncertainly. "Hundreds of 'em," went on Mrs. Driver, "running and squeaking. I saw 'em, I tell you." "Well, there ain't nothing there now," said Crabfell, and he gave a final stir round with his boot. "Then they've run away," she cried. "Under the floor, up inside the walls. The place is alive with them." "Well," said Cramfurl stolidly, "maybe. But if you ask me, I think it's that boy, where he hides things." His eye brightened and he went down on one knee. "Where he's got the ferret, I shouldn't wonder." "Listen," cried Mrs. Driver, and there was a despairing note in her voice. "You've got to listen. This wasn't no boy, and it wasn't no ferret." She reached for the back of the chair and lowered herself clumsily onto the floor. She came beside him to the edge of the hole. "They had hands and faces, I tell you. Look," she said, pointing. "See that? It's a bed. And now I come to think of it, one of them was in it." We can see here Mrs. Driver in the light, pointing and gasping, as, I presume, our friends the clocks make their desperate escape. "Now you come to think of it," said Cramfurl. "Yes," went on Mrs. Driver firmly, "and there's something else I come to think of. Remember that girl, Rosa Pickhatchet? The one that was simple. Well, simple or not, she saw one on the drawing-room mantelpiece with a beard." "One what?" asked Cramfurl. Mrs. Driver glared at him. "What I've been telling you about. One of these mice dressed up," said Cramfurl. "Not mice," Mrs. Driver almost shouted. "Mice don't have beards." "But you said," began Cramfurl. "Yes, I know I said it. Not that these had beards. But what would you call them? What could they be but mice?" "Not so loud," whispered Cramfurl. "You'll wake the house up." "Oh, they can't hear," said Mrs. Driver. "Not through the baize door." She went to the stove and picked up the fire tongs. "And what if they do? We ain't done nothing. Move over," she went on, "and let me get at the hole." One by one, Mrs. Driver picked things out, with many shocked gasps, cries of amazement, and "did you evers?" She made 2 piles on the floor, one of valuables, and one of what she called rubbish. Curious objects dangled from the tongs. "Would you believe it? Her best lace handkerchiefs. Look, here's another, and another. And my big mattress needle, I knew I had one. My silver thimble, if you please, and one of hers. And look, oh my, at the walls, the cottons. No wonder you can never find a reel of white cotton if you want one. Potatoes, nuts. Look at this, a pot of caviar, eh? Caviar, eh? No, it's too much, it really is. Dolls' chairs, tables, and look at all this blotting paper. So that's where it goes. Oh, my goodness gracious," she cried, suddenly, her eyes staring. "What is this?" Mrs. Driver laid down the tongs and leaned over the hole, tentatively and fearfully, as though afraid of being stung. "It's a watch. An emerald watch. Her watch. And she's never missed it." Her voice rose. "And it's going. Look, you can see by the kitchen clock. 12:25. Mrs. Driver sat down suddenly on a hard chair. Her eyes were staring, and her face looked white and flabby, as though deflated. You know what this means? She said to Crampfurl. No, he said. The police, said Mrs. Driver. That's what this means. A case for the police. And that, my friends, is where we shall end the story for today, but it is not the end of the story, though we are getting close. Next time, on Soft Stories, we shall finish The Borrowers. I am excited to see the conclusion of this book. I have really enjoyed reading it with you, and I hope that you have enjoyed experiencing the story with me. But I should not be too nostalgic yet, for we still have one part to go. 3 chapters left. Next time on Soft Stories. But until next we meet, I wish you all the best, and goodbye.